All right, guys. So I apologize again for my voice. It is starting to get back to normal. But we are going to go ahead and discuss the first two sections of chapter 13. So um, remember in chapter 6, we introduced the 5 basic strategies for investigating variables and their relationships. And we've already talked about all of them. This is the last one. So we've already talked about experimental, we've talked about non-experimental, we've talked about quasi-experimental, we've talked about correlational in the last chapter, and now we are going to discuss descriptive. Um, so the icebreaker here is to just try to think of one word, or you could do this a couple times, but that you think of when you think of the word descriptive. Um, so some synonyms just to get you thinking: um, illustrative, expressive, detailed, specified, elaborate or elaborated, depicted, comprehensive. All of those words are kind of getting you in the mindset of what descriptive research is trying to do. Um, so here are your chapter objectives. There are 5 on this slide, and then there are 4 on this slide. So there's 9 total for this chapter. And so to introduce you to the descriptive research method, remember that it is called descriptive because it is different from the other 4 strategies we've discussed, because we are not trying to explain relationships. We're not trying to find out why something is happening. We're not looking for the cause of something. We are literally just describing a variable or a set of variables individually. It is only describing, no explaining, nothing, deeper than that. I like the way that your book describes it. It says that the descriptive research method is basically taking a snapshot showing the current status of a specific variable or behavior. So that's a really great way to say that. Here are some examples at the very beginning of your chapter. I'm not going to go through all these because you can read these in your chapter, but all of these bullet points are examples of descriptive research, and it's what you probably think of when you first thought of statistics. When you first started taking this course, this is probably what you thought of. Um, because this is what is presented in the media most often, is descriptive things like this. You can see that all of these are not trying to explain anything. There's not a why or a how or anything like that. It's literally just stating or describing something about these variables, right? Um, and so again, I really like that your book describes it as a snapshot showing the current status or of a specific variable or behavior. You can see that right there in the middle of your screen. So I really do like that. That is a great way to think about descriptive research. Okay, so this first section is going to be going over learning objective 1, which is what is the purpose of descriptive strategy, descriptive research strategy, and how does it differ, which we've already kind of talked about a little bit, from the other strategies, and how do we identify it in a study. And it's really just this one slide for this first part, because it's fairly simple to introduce to you. Again, the goal is to describe a single variable, or if there's multiple variables we're interested in, we're going to describe each of them individually. And then we're measuring the variables or the set of variables as they exist naturally, where there's, again, no manipulation, nothing like that. This is not experimental. And then it's not concerned with relationships between variables. Again, we're just describing the variables themselves. And so the results from descriptive studies can be really helpful in starting the research process on a certain topic, laying that foundational um, um, information, gathering descriptive information about these variables so that we can then decide where we want to go from there. And it can also help capture really interesting, naturally occurring behavior that we would have maybe missed with some of the other strategies because of all of the manipulation and the control and looking for specific relationships. When if we just let the behaviors occur naturally, there may have been other things that we would have been able to observe. So a lot of interesting things can happen with descriptive research. So that is it for the first section, which is why we are going to move on to the second section here. Um, so the second section is talking specifically about the observational research design. So this is a type of descriptive research. It's the first type we're going to talk about, and we're going to discuss learning objectives 2 through 5, which is describing the 2 problems with behavioral observation and how we minimize them, the 3 techniques that researchers use to quantify behavioral observations, and the 3 techniques for sampling observations. And then we're going to define content analysis and archival research. We're going to describe observational research design specifically, and discuss the strengths and weaknesses of it and the difference between naturalistic observation, participant observation, and contrived observation. So let's jump right in. So the researcher observes, obviously, in observational research, right? That's what observational research design is literally behavioral observation. So they're systematically recording the behavior of individuals to describe that behavior. Again, the results are used simply to describe the variable being studied. We're not explaining or offering any kind of, explanation for it. The example is matching, goodness gracious. The examples your book gives are mating behavior of birds, or setting up an observation of parent-child interactions at a playground, or simply observing shopping behavior at a mall. So all of that is just simple behavioral observation. Now, we talked about in chapter 3 behavioral observation as a measurement technique. And it can be used, behavioral observation, you're probably thinking, we've talked about this before. We have. Behavioral observation can be used in lots of different research strategies and designs, experimental, correlational, a lot of different ones. But here, when we're talking about observational research design for descriptive research, we are using behavioral observation as a measurement technique for descriptive purposes only. Again, for descriptive research, we are only describing, we are not explaining or anything like that. So behavioral observation, what are the 2 measurement problems? What are the problems with behavioral observation? So one main problem is that behaviors need to be occurring naturally. We don't want to disrupt them or influence them by having an observer there. So that obviously raises questions of demand characteristics and reactivity that we talked about in chapter 3. So basically the participants acting unnaturally, changing their behavior because they know they're being observed. Obviously that is a problem, right? The second problem is that the observations are based, at least in part, on a subjective judgment. Somebody is observing and recording this behavior. And so it's a potential reliability issue because would a different observer, would somebody else interpret the behavior and write down the same behavioral observations and interpret it in the same way as the person that recorded the observations? Because again, there's a little bit of subjectivity there. We all might make a different judgment there. So how do we address these issues? The first problem of possible, reactivity and demand characteristics can be addressed by simply concealing the observer. So if the observer can't be seen, then the participants don't know they're being observed, then they are not going to change their behavior theoretically, right? Now that can also raise issues of ethics because, if they don't know they're being observed, is that okay? And so or in other situations, it may be impossible for them to avoid being that the observer is seen. And so an alternative is that they can be habituated to the observer's presence. What that means is um, this happens a lot in classroom observations. The observer would go into the classroom a week or two before the actual observation is going to take place, and they would be in there every day for a week or two. And so the kids eventually get so used to that person being there, they forget they're there. And so then they start acting naturally. And so by the time they actually perform their behavioral observations, the children have gone back to doing their normal behavior and not trying to change their behavior because of that person in the room. They've forgotten that they're there. Um, so that's what habituated means. So how do we solve the second problem of the subjectivity of the observations? Well, the main thing is iterator reliability. But first, we develop a list of well-defined categories of behavior. An example is in that video game violence or aggression study, they had categories of behavior, and one of the categories was aggressive behavior. And so they gave specific examples of what aggressive behavior entailed. So hitting, kicking, or pushing someone, fighting with someone, name calling or arguing, teasing, frightening someone, or gossiping. If an observer saw any of those behaviors, those are clearly defined, then they would be able to write that down as an aggressive behavior being observed. Also, you have to use well-trained observers that know to keep subjectivity out of it as much as possible, and how to follow these categories and these this list. The and then the last um, thing to address here is using this iterator reliability method. So that just means using multiple observers. We've talked about this before, and you compare their observations. And one of the ways is through the correlational method we discussed in the last chapter. You can see how well they correlate. If they correlate with each other very well, if they're very similar, then you know that those observations are likely authentic. They are likely objective. If they vary wildly from each other, then there's too much subjectivity going on, and they may need to reassess how they're observing um, those behaviors. So how do we quantify these behavioral observations in order to get data, right? There's three techniques you can use. One is frequency. And so that is counting the instances of each behavior, which is what I was just kind of talking about with that video game study, where you could say this child exhibited 3 aggressive acts in 30 minutes. So you just wrote a tally mark within that 30-minute period every time they did an aggressive behavior. And so that would give you a number, a piece of data. There's a duration method where instead of counting the frequency, you're doing the amount of time that you observe a certain behavior. So an example would be if you were looking at how often an autistic child plays alone versus in a group. In a 30-minute period, you could say you observed this participant playing alone for 18 minutes of that 30-minute period. So that would be duration. And then interval is when you divide the observation period into intervals. Goodness gracious, I can't talk. And you record behavior during each interval. So you could say within that 30-minute period that we talked about, we're going to divide that into 31-minute intervals. Okay. And so each minute is a new interval. And so you could say that you observe the autistic child playing in group play in 12 of those 30-minute long intervals. So remember, there was 30 intervals because we were doing minute long intervals for 30 minutes. And 12 of those 30 intervals, the child played in some sort of group, engaged in some sort of group play at some point. The interval method is a little bit more complicated, but it can balance possible issues with frequency or duration methods, because in certain instances, the example that they used in your book was if you're observing bird behavior and you're writing down every time a bird sings, if the bird sings continuously for the whole 30-minute observation period, then they only get a frequency of 1. But they sang the entire time. So that makes it look like they only sang once during the 30-minute period, but really they sang the entire time. So that's not really giving you the accurate information that you're looking for. And so sometimes you have to adjust your methods, or use the interval method, to combat those possible issues. Okay, sampling observations. When observing complex situations where there's a lot going on or a lot of people, especially in a more naturalistic environment, researchers can record the situation and then replay the recording later as many times as they need to gather certain observations. And when they do this, they're going to look for different things each time in order to organize all of this and be able to observe the things they're wanting to observe. And so one of the ways that you can do this is through time sampling, which is where you would um, create these intervals, right? Like we talked about, and then you would observe for one interval, and then the next interval, you would be recording your observations. And then the next interval, you would be observing again. And then the next interval, you would be recording what you saw. And you alternate that back and forth, observe, record, observe, record. Event sampling is a little bit different. You would be observing and recording in every interval, but each interval you're going to focus on a different event or a different behavior. So you're going to have a specific action or a specific event or a specific behavior you're going to look at in the first interval. And then in the second interval, you're going to look at something else. In the third interval, you're going to look at something else. And then individual sampling is, instead of an event or behavior, it's an individual, it's a person. So you're going to focus on one participant that whole interval. The second interval, you're going to focus on a different participant the whole time. Third interval, different participant. You get the idea. And so that's 3 different ways that they can break up these observations in order to, make sure that they're getting all of the data, all the possible observations. And again, that's going to depend on what it is that you're observing and how complicated it is. Okay, so there are 2 other types of research here that we want to make sure you guys know. In addition to observing behavior as it occurs in real life, you can also observe behaviors in media, literature, movies, TV, all that kind of stuff. If you want to analyze like TV violence or sexual behavior in movies or whatever it is, that would be called content analysis, because you're not actually observing real people in real time. You're observing recorded media things. An example of this was the study where they looked at Super Bowl commercials from 2010 to 2014, and they wanted to study the demographics of the people that were in the commercials. And they said it was interesting because there was 30% of the commercials from that time period had mature adults age 65 or older in their commercials, which is a lot higher than the actual population or viewers of the Super Bowl. And so it was interesting to note that. The second type is archival research, which is actually looking at historical records. It's measuring behaviors or events that occurred in the past. It's looking back at historical records for whatever particular behavior you're looking for. The example in your book was where they studied the last names of married couples. They looked at birth records and marriage records and telephone listings to see um, if there was a pattern to the type of last name that married people ended up with. And it was interesting that they found that a lot of people, or it was a higher than chance that people would that women would end up with a last name that was similar to their maiden name. So that was interesting. That's not the case for me, but it is interesting. Okay, so the content and archival research that we just talked about, the content analysis and the archival research, it follows the same rules for behavioral observation that we just discussed on the slide, 2 slides before this, where they establish those behavioral categories and that list of behaviors that go with each category. They're using either frequency, duration, or interval method for obtaining those numerical scores. And they're going to make sure they use multiple observers so that they get some sort of inter-rater reliability. And so that's another, just a summary slide of what we already talked about. And then types of observation and examples. So There's three different ways that you can do these observations. You can do naturalistic observation, or another way to say it is non-participant observation, where there's no researcher intervention at all. An example of that is Jane Goodall, who studied apes, but she did not interact with them. Or if you're just going to study couple behaviors, either through video or in natural settings where they don't know they're being observed. Participant observation instead is where you are actually interacting with the participants. You become one of them. An example from your book is where they enrolled researchers they were pseudo patients. They pretended to be patients in a mental hospital to observe the behavior of the staff and the patients inside the mental hospital. And then contrived observation is, or structured observation is where you set up a situation so that you can see a desired behavior of participants. So you're setting up, you are setting up the observation. And so it is not quite as natural as the other two. Developmental psychologists use this a lot to set up situations to study children. So the strengths and weaknesses of these three designs, this is table 13.1 in your book. So just to go over very quickly, naturalistic observation is great because you're able to observe real world behavior. It's more natural. It's useful for behaviors that you can't manipulate in experimental settings. The actual behaviors are recorded and observed. It's very high in internal and even external validity. But the problem is it's very time consuming because you don't know when the behaviors are going to occur that you're looking for. So you could potentially be watching and observing for a long time. There's the potential that the observer could possibly influence if they know they're being observed, or if they, are get wind of it. And then also the subjective interpretation of the observer. They may interpret behavior a certain way that is not really truly what the behavior, how the behavior could or should be interpreted. Participant observation is great when natural observation is impossible. They talked about like in a cult setting or in a setting with the mental hospital setting, but getting information that's not accessible otherwise. Participant observation is great for that. It also gives a unique perspective to the observer because they are actually participating in it too. So they get a completely different perspective than observing from a distance. But again, it can be time consuming because you have to wait for behaviors that you want to see to happen. There's the potential for the loss of objectivity because the observer is actually participating in the experience. So they may not remain objective and they may forget that they need to remain objective as an objective observer. And there's also the increased chance for the observer to actually influence the behavior, again, because they are actually a part of the experience. So they may end up accidentally influencing the behavior of the participants. Contrived observation, you do not have to wait for the behavior to occur because you're setting it up to observe that specific behavior immediately. So it's not as time consuming. So that's good. But also, that means it's going to be less natural. There's the potential that it's not going to be as internally or externally valid because of that. So in general, observational research design can have high internal and external validity in the sense that there's going to be actual behaviors. It's not self-reported like a survey. You're actually witnessing the real behaviors. And with the exception of contrived observation, it's going to be very natural. But there's possible ethical issues, as I mentioned before, with is it spying? But also observational research design, again, is a descriptive design. So it's only describing the behavior. It is not explaining it or offering any sort of explanation. And so that can be a potential issue. So that's it for the first two sections. So let's do our knowledge check. Which technique would probably be used by a researcher who wanted to observe behaviors in a private social club? Well, as we talked about with cults and mental hospitals, participant observation is best here because the researcher can engage in the activities as the people being observed, and they can get access to these people that they wouldn't be able to observe a private social club from a distance. That wouldn't happen. They have to get in there and be a part of it in order to observe that behavior. Okay, and then I'm going to do our learning check. Let me skip to it really quickly. And then this is that table 13.1 that we just talked about in your book. And so learning check number one, during a study using behavioral research strategy, it is common to have two observers record behavior simultaneously. What is the purpose of this? Again, that's that inter-rater reliability. We want to have two different observers so that we are making sure they're remaining objective. We don't want the observations to be subjective. And then in an observational study of children diagnosed with autism, you record how much time each child spends playing alone during a 30-minute period, which method of behavior. Okay, so which method of quantifying behavior? It's how much time they are playing alone. So that would be duration. Frequency would be how many times you observe them playing alone. If you're saying how long they're playing alone, that's a duration. And then when researchers use behavioral observation techniques to measure behaviors in movies, what is this called? So remember, that's called content analysis when they're observing behavior in media of some kind. And then this last question is actually the one we just did on our knowledge check, which was talking about participant observation in a private social club. So that is it. If you guys have any questions about anything from these first two sections, let me know.